Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for our Fraud Guardrails for Your Grant Program webinar. My name is Jessica, and I'll be the facilitator for today's presentation. Really quick, let's go over some housekeeping items. First of all, this presentation will last approximately 50 minutes, followed by a quick question and answer segment. This recording of this webinar will be sent to you within a couple of days. Also, please be sure to keep your microphones muted. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to post them in the QA feature located on the top of your screen. We will also be posting some resources in the chat feature, so be sure to check them out. Now we'll do some quick introductions. First, we have Mary Beth Vanderwill. She founded the Vanderwill Group in 2003 and also served as a key member of Chicago Public Schools turnaround team, and later a two-time inspector general who has managed thousands of investigations in the public and the private sector. She has also overseen grants monitoring in over 20 states. We also have guest speaker attorney Liz McCabe, who before joining the Vanderwill Group to spearhead our utilities and other initiatives, Liz managed compliance, procurement, and contracts for more than $10 billion of grants for the state of New Jersey. Now, with all of that, I turn it over to you, Mary Beth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about a case study that many of you are very familiar with. But this case study presents a framework for talking about oversights in the grants world. It also shows the amazing political and legal complexity that overseers of grant funds can run into. It's not on the face of it, it's a black and white case, but it really was fraught with a lot of political and legal complexity. Then we'll talk about the oversight continuum and just a framework that we use in our company to look at oversight. We'll discuss some guardrails for program leadership, but also for political leadership. And then we'll just take a minute or so to talk about what our firm does. So again, as many of you are familiar, Feeding Our Future was the single largest fraud in using COVID money in American history. So there was a $250 million theft of federal funds. 75 people were charged. More than 50 people pleaded guilty or were convicted at trial, including, by the way, someone who was trying to bribe a juror in the midst of us. The money was used on lavish lifestyles, cars, boats, home mortgages, jewelries, and more. The majority of the lost funds were not recoverable. A great deal, tens of millions of taxpayer dollars were sent to Somalia, spent on investments in China, Kenya, and Turkey. The non-for-profit was run by Amy Bach, who was a sponsor that oversaw 2,000 reported feeding sites. And in reality, she facilitated and received kickbacks from a network of fraudulent organizations and programs. And these programs were fabricating invoices, inflating meal counts, faking attendance rosters of children. Feeding Our Future, this not-for-profit, grew from 2.4 million to nearly 200 million in 2021. Now, the Minnesota Department of Education saw very early on what was going on, and they started raising red flags. They had complaints coming in of unethical recruitment of food sites, operating sites without permission, haphazard food distribution, complaints about demanding kickbacks from vendors. And part of the story that I don't think is told enough is that the department was trying hard, pretty early on to stop this, but they were not receiving support from the powers to be. The nonprofit tax status was revoked by the IRS in February of 2020. There were unrealistic data patterns in the reimbursement claims. Adeli was saying, we're serving 3,000 children a day, 7 days a week. Why don't you pay us for that? All right, using, again, American taxpayer money. The restaurant was saying it was serving 5,000 children per day, ultimately claiming to have served more than 3.9 million meals in a year and a half. And, one area, one town was, a feeding site said they were feeding more than the entire town population. So here are some of the key failure points. Now, the Minnesota Legislative Auditor, Judy Randall, said that the department was ill-prepared to handle the burgeoning fraud. It said that it lacked clear, detailed, or updated policies and procedures for, many areas of the program. It lacked dedicated financial or accounting staff despite the massive size of the program. It lacked trained investigative staff, and a group of nutritionists were in charge of investigating allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse. And these are people who do not have training or understanding of what it's like to go into war with a fraudster. And when you're in something this big and this size, you really are in a political legal war. And the department lacked its own legal expertise. It didn't have a general counsel until January of 2022. And we'll see in a moment why that was important. Judy Randall said the department failed to investigate indicators of the alleged fraud, as we just said. And two key controls failed. One was the single audit, which, as we all know, is the grant audit that's required under the Uniform Guidance, which is the overall regulatory set of regulations that oversees grants. And then the grants monitoring also failed. The audits did not meet federal audit standards, and we took a look at them, and they had mathematical errors and incorrect dates. And they also showed that this organization was not ready to receive this kind of money. It was in a deficit. It wasn't even financially viable. And the audit also showed that 100% of the food funds were going to overhead and administration. And that may or may not have been appropriate because this was a sponsor, but still it was a red flag and raised some questions. Again, Judy Randall, the legislative auditor, said these irregularities were not acted upon. And the audit firm eventually lost its CPA license. It had provided audits for 7 of the organizations involved in the fraud. The grants monitoring provided no documentation. And actually, I want to just change that a little bit because there ended up being one administrative monitoring review in 2018. And this noted serious findings. Normal controls were relaxed because it was the pandemic. So there weren't the site visits that were supposed to be. There were some things missing that a normal monitoring review would have detected. And we, at our firm, have been interested in this case for a very long time. And I know we have people on this webinar who know a lot about this because they come from Minnesota. Would love to talk to them and get their perspective. But we filed some freedom of information requests, and the only response we received was one monitoring document, and this was it. And you'll see that this document confirms that grants monitoring was occurring, except that you'll see on the right-hand side at the bottom that the person who signed this was Amy Bach herself. So through federal rules and through the department, the monitoring was done by the very person that was committing the fraud. And as you'll see later on, we are huge advocates of separating monitoring from management. So in reality now, this looks all very clear cut. How could this go on? It's a great question. How could it go on so long? But there were some political considerations. There was a powerful Somali community lashed back. They litigated against MDA. They accused it of racism. They argued that they used the pull on the victim, the heartstrings, right, by arguing that tens of thousands of children would go without food if its site applications were denied. And very surprisingly, a judge was siding with Feeding Our Future, which made MDE, feeling like it was handcuffed. Plus, there was a 2017 court decision in another case that told MDA, you can't apply your own criteria. You have to get authorization in state administrative rules, which, again, so for us that have been around for a long time, that sounds crazy. because a program has the ability to identify what the criteria is, but this judge disagreed, and it ruled in feeding our future favorable rulings. There was not just one, there were a couple. The specific issue of financial viability, which is a basic in due diligence, right? You don't want to give this kind of money to a firm that doesn't have the management capacity to handle that set of funds. I mean, to grow to that amount of money in such a short time would take a massive amount of financial systems, operating systems, experienced management teams. You'd have to have so many things in place to support that kind of growth. None of that was in place. In fact, it was found over and over that they lack that financial viability. But MDA said they weren't getting support from the USDA. They were asking for guidance. And MDE, I'm sorry, I keep saying MDA. MDE notified law enforcement, was told no criminal investigation be forthcoming. They also notified the Inspector General. So as a result of this scheme, the USDA has created an Office of Program Integrity. They've encouraged states to move away from this one-size-fits-all monitoring. They've changed how financial reviews should be done, including unannounced visits and their site visits. But they also are talking more and more about fines, right? And I want to turn over to Liz, because that's, as many of you know, is one of the trends that we're seeing in this administration for increased penalties. Liz, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, Mary Beth, and good afternoon again to everyone. In an early executive order dated January 27th of this year, the president directed federal agencies to analyze their financial assistance programs for various compliance reasons, performance factors, and most notably, adequate oversight. So the agencies were authorized to initiate investigations where warranted, to identify and then address underperforming recipients. And the results could be penalties, and the ultimate penalty of canceling the award or pulling back the funds. Almost 9 months later now, with literally billions of dollars in grant funding terminated, we can see that the agencies have in fact acting on these directives. So I think for the grants community, we don't want to create a reason for penalties and possibly clawbacks. And with this intense focus on the effective use of taxpayer dollars, the importance of grants compliance, and it's always important, but I think that importance is heightened. We'd have to dial that up a few degrees, and obviously including the prevention of waste, fraud, and abuse.
That's right. Okay, thank you. So this is a little framework that we at the Vanderweel Group use to kind of simplify the oversight process. There's other rubrics, of course, COSO and the Green Book and such. But this one just gives us a really quick overview of how we can look at risk and oversight. Now, our firm is taking the 200 grant processes identified by the federal government for program managers of federal grants, and we're breaking that down. We've broken that down, line by line by line, and attached to each of those different guardrails, for example, uniform guidance requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But this is, for the purposes of this presentation, this is a simple way to look at it. So any oversight program starts by identifying what the standards are. And we'll talk more about each of these in a moment. Identifying the risk, building risk awareness, developing infrastructure, communicating standards, testing those standards, detecting integrity breaches and non-compliance, investigating them, remediating or penalizing, and then we go back to lessons learned and report outcomes. So identifying the standards builds the legal program and regulatory framework. You're identifying standards not only in the uniform guidance, which as you know, is changed in October to increase scrutiny on fraud of subrecipients, and that was in Liz's last webinar. She talked about that. But identify the standards in the uniform guidance authorizing legislations, and program rules. We like to create a compliance matrix that map each of these requirements. We like to put in there not only what the standard is, the citation, obviously the text, but also what is the evidence to prove compliance or non-compliance. And this is a way, this document guides your entire program. It guides obviously your application, it guides your reimbursement requests, but for the monitors, we also add things that will make the monitoring consistent, like sample finding language, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want to put a team of monitors in the field and have them all interpreting different things in their own way. So this keeps everybody on track in the same way. And part of this, especially now, is monitoring those changes in the single audit process, which, as you know, L&B is rolling out some opportunity to change the process. They're saying single audits are not effective enough, that they're not aligning with administration priorities and such. As we said, they're putting in more penalties for non-clients. They're really looking at eligibility in the SNAP area, for example. The lunch area knows that they're really cracking down on ineligible people receiving these funds. Identify the risk. It starts out by understanding no organization is immune to large-scale risks and integrity challenges. And that someone's got their back, and maybe getting their back is with resources, but with legal help, whatever they need to fight fraud. Risk assessments. There's time-tested principles of risk. And then there's the new tools, which we'll talk about in a moment. And those tools include artificial intelligence and data analytics, and we use both. So in our next webinar, we're going to dive into this a lot deeper, but there's a difference between data analytics and artificial intelligence. Data analytics is your traditional looking at large mega sets of data, megadata, and saying, and putting in there predefined patterns. When you're doing data analytics of structured data, which is data that is in a specific cell, for example, in Excel, might be a number, might be a date, it might be text that's limited to a number of characters, et cetera. That's called structured data. Data analytics is great for when you know what your risks are in advance, you know what your algorithms or patterns are. And you're just a second, we got some people coming in. You're requesting, you're querying the data, and what you'll get is a very specific outcome, right? So if you asked data analytics to look at who are the top 50 vendors receiving funding, it will come up with precisely those 50 vendors based on formulas in either Excel or your software. And you can take that to the bank. You can use that in your reports. Now, artificial intelligence is a whole new game because it analyzes both structured and unstructured data, which means that I can load into our tool audits, I can manuals, I can do put in, as I have a 4-hour training I've done on fraud, I can put in our case, our company uses a lot of proposals. Right? All these different formats can go into artificial intelligence. We are having some limitations on big data sets in Excel, and we're working to resolve that. The tool that we're using allows Excel, but it's limited in the number of characters, so we're working with our provider on that issue. But when that Excel is converted to a PDF, it will read the data. Artificial intelligence can identify risks that you would never think about, right? And patterns, and not only risk, patterns in transactions. And it can do it in less than 2 hours. That's the amazing thing about artificial intelligence. You can learn, you can get to the heart of the matter in a very short period of time, but it is prone to error and incompleteness. So for example, when I put in the Minnesota legislative audit into artificial intelligence, it gave me highlights, but it missed the nuance, the nuance of all these legal battles that were affecting the decisions that the Minnesota Department of Education was affecting their decisions. And some of those were in the footnotes. Artificial intelligence is not great at picking up all the nuance. And so you always have to validate and verify anything you use that comes out of artificial intelligence. So here are some queries that we do of artificial intelligence. I'm sorry, these are the time-tested principles we were talking about. So these are risks that are in the uniform guidance when you have large inflows of new funding or new programs. And again, all of these you really saw in Feeding Our Future. The program type, if it's a high number of beneficiaries, if it's a highly complex program, prior audit findings, complaints, management inexperienced in grant programs, new financial systems, outdated technology. We had when unemployment benefits surged in the pandemic, a lot of these agencies that were state agencies that were giving out unemployment had old technology, right? Their technology was supposed to report on specific data points, but I know in one case they had COBOL, and they didn't have enough programmers and they didn't have enough time to change the technology to support this massive amount of growth. So they were doing a lot of things by hand. Well, can you imagine in these, programs are tens and hundreds of millions of dollars doing some of these financial processes by hand? And I do want to talk just a moment about the complexity. We in the fraud profession, we have something called the fraud triangle, which talks about opportunity and motive. And the opportunity is when program systems are in disarray. That's where fraudsters just flourish because they can take advantage of those systems in disarray. And, we've seen fraudsters who know the procedures better than the people who are managing the procedures. And they know exactly where the weaknesses in those procedures are. But fraudsters flourish in that environment. And the traditional time-tested principles of risk management acknowledge that. Now, in AI, some of the sample queries for unstructured data, which combines, by the way, can combine tables with text, right? So you can have an audit that has all these financial tables in it and query it, and AI will pull out both of those. And so these are some of our sample queries. So here's just some examples that came out of AI on risk assessment. We looked at a large number of developments and found that the grantees, and that's a term we'll use, although in this case it was called something else, but the grantees were making over $1 million of interest on projects not being built. That came out within less than 2 hours of queries. Others were investing these grant funds and losing money. We saw that 100% of nearly $300,000 in payroll expense was spent on overhead. None went into operating the program. The audits from Feeding Our Future showed the same exact data 2 years in a row. These kinds of things would, in the old days, take me months to find, combing through, documents. I mean, one of the things I would never have queried or thought of to even look for is that a grant reimbursement is done in the exact dollar amount to the penny for the amount that that developer was in a financial loss position. So their P&L reported a loss, and the program forwarded them the exact amount, which on the face of it, again, AI is good for asking questions, not answering them. But on the face of it, it looks like they're trying to make that developer look better on paper so they're financially stable. 2 audits in a row of the same organization, the year end did not match the opening end. In one case, we were looking at documents in the midst of an investigations, and they had a special shredding cost that came to the surface for a little less than $3,500. Another case we looked at, AI popped up that some of the payroll expenditures were 16 cents, right? And again, these are just asking a lot of questions, but it's just fascinating. And the speed with which AI can work is unbelievable. Billing risk awareness. So once you know what the risks are, you communicate them to your program people and your grantees as well. Your grantees need to know, especially if your grantees are handing out payments to individual beneficiaries, what do they need to look for? So again, a lot of these folks have no training in fraud. And you know, we knew of one agency that was getting together with like agencies on a monthly basis, you know, from across the country and saying, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? Well, we're seeing this particular scheme, or we're even seeing this particular IP address that keeps coming up, and submitting applications in bulk for a program, of course, for which they were ineligible. Developing program infrastructure. I can't harp on this enough. Now, the politicians, as you know, and I'm not, you know, anti-politician, but everybody has their role and their place, and good ones do an amazing job. But the politicians love to harp on what went wrong after the fact. And they'll have endless hearings about, you didn't have this in place, you didn't have this in place. But before the program starts, always is supportive, because, you know, forgive me for using this word, but infrastructure is not sexy, right? It doesn't make headlines. Nobody's going to win an election based on, we made them put the infrastructure in place, the program infrastructure, right? And so this gets overlooked, and but it's very, very important. And of course, part of that infrastructure is the required internal controls. One of the things we like to do in our firm is to look at the resources. So we did that for Liz, and when she was at the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs Division of Disaster Recovery, we said, well, do you have enough monitors? Well, let's map out what is the time a monitoring review takes, right? What is the process? How many hours will that consume in a year? And do you have enough monitors? I have a friend who was in the military, and his commander said to him, he kept saying, make sure everybody takes their mandated training. Make sure everybody takes their mandated training. So he went home on a weekend and he mapped out all the mandated training and how many hours each course took. And he came back and he says, sir, Commander, sir, if everybody takes their mandated training, they are going to be working for, they're going to be doing nothing but taking training for a year and a half, 7 days a week. Right. And so government does that. A number of us in our team are from government, and we understand this mentality, this pile on, without really understanding what it takes to execute a program well. And so when you can take a capacity planner and say, look, this, like my friend did with his commander, you know, well, that makes people think. And of course, capability is really important. Communicate the standards. Now, we talked about communicating the risks to the program staff, but of course you want to communicate the standards to your grantees as well, and reinforce that through technical assistance. This technical assistance, as you know, is very important. We just heard the Department of Justice has ended their technical assistance, and that means the states are going to be picking up some of that for your justice grants. What we saw with COVID was $1 trillion or more going out the door, and there were many new grantees. And these grantees, many of them understood the communities really well. They understood the problems of the communities, but they're not grant-ready folks, right? They don't know the grant rules. And I was out on a monitoring visit, and this wasn't a grantee, it was a vendor, but she was receiving millions of dollars, and she doesn't come from a management world. She was working 12, 14 hours a day. She was very well intended. She didn't know how to recruit. She didn't know. So as part of our technical assistance, we say, hey, you can look at, here are some ways you can recruit a project manager. Here are some things you should think about. But also, she had no idea whether she was profitable in these millions of dollars of projects she was getting. We explained to her that what a rolling forecast is, and that you need to ask your accountant to provide you this analysis that's going to show you when you're going to run out of cash, which isn't, but accountants, as we know, give you financials, but they don't always give you the cash flow tools you need to do your forward projections. So that type of technical assistance is really important. It's not just about compliance, it's how to manage your programs. And again, that's a little bit unconventional. But we do things a little unconventionally when our clients want it. If our clients don't want that, then if they want to focus 100% on compliance, that's fine too. And then, of course, testing the standards is being done through single audits, monitoring, data analytics, I should say, put in here, looking, creating your processes for reimbursements. You're looking at what those reimbursement claims look like. That's one way of testing the standards. So monitoring, I think many of us are just familiar with the rules. Monitoring has to be done with each program, function, activity. Now, this formal monitoring plan is technically not in the rules, but where we get that is our firm every year looks at about 1,500 findings that come out through the single audits through to the states on the state grant programs. And we see over and over that the accountants are citing organizations if they have no formal monitoring plan, or if they don't have a risk assessment included in that. And frankly, to be honest with you, because many of those auditors are CPAs, they come from a audit background, that risk assessment is something that's drilled into them in the accounting profession. Sometimes we had one client that they were applying accounting rules to how the risk assessment was done statistically, and we were able to get a finding go away because we proved to them that the rules for monitoring are different and they're not under the same rules as auditing. There's definitely overlap between the two professions, and they're both important. But monitoring is a different profession than auditing. One of the biggest advantages of monitoring is the real-time aspect of it. You're doing it while the program is ongoing many times. And of course, the rest of the slide you can read. Now, the last two are, Vanderweel group preferences. We believe in multidisciplinary teams that have the program staff on it. There's nothing more irritating to an auditee if you have someone who does not understand the program. And so either the monitor has to learn that program and really steep themselves in the ins and outs of that program, or you need to have someone at the table who understands the program, your fiscal staff, and now increasingly we have the fraud experience, okay, with the new uniform guidance requirements. And then we're going to talk about this more, we personally believe, and this is a preference, it's not a requirement, that the monitoring be done separate from the management of the program. And I'm sorry, this is where the data analytics come in to detect the integrity breaches. And again, AI is giving us amazing capability to analyze trends and transactions and audits, financial program reports. Just huge amounts of data can be put together and compared. That's the beauty of AI, is that you can take a data point out of a spreadsheet or a PDF, because it has to, there's a little issue there, but it can take one data point from one document. You can upload 100 up to 300 documents in that pool, and then look for trends. And then the investigations. Now, this seems straightforward, but it really isn't. I mean, what we found in Feeding Our Future is these nutritionists that did not have a fraud background were in charge of the investigations. And one of the things that I say in our fraud training is the characteristic of fraudsters that, they, in the beginning, they play dumb, but next they go on the warpath. And if you don't know that, you back off. We had a superintendent in Chicago Public Schools that was indicted in fairly recent years. And the mayor's office questioned a contract that she was putting through. She went on the warpath. How dare you micromanage me? How dare you? And so, these young people in the mayor's office, like, we got to approve this contract. We got to approve this contract. She's really upset. She's really upset, right? So they approved the contract. Well, that contract was subject to kickbacks. And by the way, her daughter was an inspector general, and her daughter's kids were benefiting from the proceeds of the kickbacks. She also had a gambling issue. And that was the quickest guilty plea in history, which means that she probably did this a lot of other places. But the point is that pushback that Feeding Our Future did is very consistent with the way a fraudster act. If you poke the bear and the bear begins to roar, right, as opposed to turn over and go back to sleep, you've hit something. And an experienced experienced investigator will know that. But there's also a lot of parts of investigations like, interview techniques, evidence collection, documentation, chain of custody, information security protocols, forensic accounting, e-discovery. There's all sorts of aspects, surveillance. We didn't, one thing that didn't ever come up that I saw, and again, our Minnesota friends in the audience will hopefully be able to inform me. I'd love to sit down and talk to you about what you saw there and what you're doing. I know you're doing a lot to correct everything that's going on, but I didn't see anything about surveillance, right? Because Department of Education said we didn't have subpoena power, but you hire a $75 an hour, maybe the rate's gone up now, and surveillance person to sit out in front of the deli for 7 days, right, and say no kids were fed, and then you compare that with the claims that were submitted, and there's your evidence that you can maybe bring to the judge. The judge's rulings were very inexplicable to me. Of course, I didn't see all the evidence that he based it on, but nevertheless, if he's presented with fraud, he might have ruled differently. So it's a very, very tricky area. And one of the things we talk about with our monitors is you don't want to, it's called trampling the evidence, right? And I have two firms that I worked with a number of years ago. Both had significant frauds and employee insider jobs. And one went in, confronted the woman, fired her on the spot, didn't do any sort of due diligence or data collection, didn't do, and then they were outraged that the woman went on to another job and never got prosecuted. Well, it's because they trampled the evidence. The other company brought us in. We spent really only 2 weeks in data collection. That's all it took. And we ended up doing what's called an operational review. And we'll talk about this more in the next webinar. But we were able to extract a full confession, got it signed, right, and got $900,000 back the next day, plus another amount, several $100,000 from insurance. That's the difference between an investigation that's well done. And I always recommend that you coordinate with the Inspector General's office when you find something and get to know them. And people are afraid of Inspector Generals, and sometimes with good reason. But let them know what you're seeing, and that's also going to protect you from being under their scrutiny if they realize you're well-intended, you're trying to do the right thing. And Feeding Our Future, that didn't work because the Inspector General was notified, and allegedly, and I say allegedly because some of these political congressional hearings are political in nature, but allegedly didn't do anything. We did not see a report coming out of that. And again, maybe our Minnesota audience can let me know more about that, because there's so much I still don't know about the case. And then, of course, remediate or penalize. It's really good to have a thoughtfully thought out rubric, right? If somebody, the vast majority of our grantees are not committing fraud. if there's a finding of non-compliance, it's usually well-intended. They didn't know. And you may want to say, okay, to your monitoring team, when are we going to do just technical assistance? We do that a lot. Right? They just need some help, right? And then what point does it escalate? How many times does it have to happen before it escalates to something greater, right? And then, of course, in the worst case scenario, you're talking recovery, civil or criminal litigation, debarment, et cetera, et cetera. And then capture your lessons learned, aggregate the findings and update and retool, your program resources, et cetera. And report outcomes. Now, one of the things we like to do is highlight the best practices and report successes. We think that's really important to build morale, and but also to generate support for your program. So for one of our clients, we created a website that just highlighted all the great things that were being done with the grant money. And I think a lot of you already do that, but I just wanted to mention that. The other thing is aggregating the systemic challenges in our monitoring when allowed to do so. And again, not every client wants it. Some clients want just very clear, check the box compliance, and that's fine. But if allowed to do so, we like to, on our boots in the ground site visits, ask, how's it going? What are your obstacles? And you'll be surprised about how many things come out that you never thought of, right? So in one school, it says we haven't had a copier for 2 years, so our kids haven't had homework for 2 years. Well, it turned out that throughout that organization, somebody in central office is sitting on these purchase orders. That's the kind of thing you wouldn't put in a normal monitoring request form, but we got through that and many, many others, through soliciting, making monitoring a two-way conversation. And I'll take a moment here to just emphasize and emphasize again that the best monitoring, we have this thing called Guardrails 360. And the reason we named it that is because you want to look, because technology is important. Right now, there's this huge focus on technology. Remember when Don Rumsfeld said, our CIA is going to go through technology, our translation, and they got rid of a lot of the human reporting. Well, that human intelligence in the Middle East, that came back to bite them. And there's still a lot of members of the intelligence community who are saying that was a really bad decision. If you technology can get you a long way and show you a lot, but it will never tell you everything. And it needs to be vetted, right? Because sometimes your data will tell you one thing and you'll find out in the field, well, there was something completely different happened, or there was a reason, or there was an underlying, like in Feeding Our Future, there was a legal issue. There was a court ruling that seemed to be hamstringing the organization. So we believe in this really holistic view to oversight that combines technology, combines the old ways with the boots on the ground intelligence. And we just think that is going to create much better decision making. Political leadership, we believe in prioritizing independent fact finding, and we have some sample language here. Took the uniform guidance and added in black what we think should go there, but this doesn't have to just go in the uniform guidance. This could go in program rules, could go in your NOFOs, your notice of funding opportunities. It could go in your grant contracts, but just something that says the monitors should not be the same people managing. It doesn't even have to cost a lot of money because it could be just switched to another person. But you can see, in the Bach case, the worst case scenario. But you can, but also even the most well-meaning program managers are, first of all, they may not have the skill sets to look for fraud, but also, in a political environment, and we're very, very familiar with highly politicized environments, nobody wants to see their dirty laundry aired, right? And so there's going to be just this either subconscious or conscious attempt, don't find too much, right? And that's totally understandable. But again, there's ways to deal with that. Again, I'm happy to talk to anybody offline if you want to discuss that in more detail. Ensure key compliance positions are in place. Minnesota put in an inspector general after this. Illinois has chief accountability officers. General counsel is something that the Minnesota put in as well. I'm also a believer that, and this is going to be a little controversial with my inspector general friends, but there needs to be some controls on your watchdogs. And because sometimes you'll have inspector generals, like in the case with allegedly, and I say allegedly, because I don't know enough about what happened there, but from the congressional hearings, the inspector general had not acted on that complaint. Who knows what happened? Maybe they, well, they know what happened, but maybe they turned it over to the FBI and they deferred. There could be very legitimate reasons. But you know, we've seen inspector generals who put out findings that are not necessarily based in a clear standard and with hitting the evidence of the crime, et cetera, et cetera. So there should be some guardrails in place, just not give inspector generals or auditors complete control. Again, that's a very controversial statement, but it has to be, somebody has to watch the watchdogs sometimes as well. And then, of course, mandated reporting and escalation procedures, hotline reporting. Certified fraud examiners is always saying year after year after year in their studies that hotlines and tips are one of the biggest ways to find fraud. That may change now with new tools for data analytics. And then with this, I'm going to turn over to Liz McKay to explain.
Yes, thank you, Mary Beth. And New Jersey received from the U.S. Treasury an allocation of over $6 billion as part of the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, COVID recovery funds. And the governor in New Jersey, by executive order, mandated that programs that were allocated $20 million or more of the ARPA funding must hire an independent integrity monitor from a pre-qualified pool of vendors. And the pool was formed through a competitive bidding process. And the programs would hire the integrity monitor through engagement queries, they were called, or you could say mini bids. And the state provided a template for the risk assessment that was a critical part of every monitoring engagement. And it laid out 12 factors, and it included a lot of the factors that Mary Beth had mentioned that are actually in the uniform guidance. What is the experience of management? Were there many applicants for this program? What kind of funding was involved here? Was it only ARPA? Was it a mix of funding? And so this template was issued for these the IMs. The idea was to, as close as possible to the beginning of the program, funds had to be obviously spent, but the idea was not to come in too late in the process, because if you come in too late, you can't course correct. And the idea of the integrity monitor was not to be a gotcha exercise, but it was to identify areas where the program could improve with respect to compliance and improve with respect to achieving the program's objectives. The IM also submitted reports monthly to the hiring agency and then quarterly for the comptroller to detail the progress in terms of this particular task, how the deliverables were being achieved. But it also provided the integrity monitor the opportunity to provide feedback. You know, what concerns, what was the IM seeing, or any irregularities that they might have encountered. So I would say that this program, Integrity Monitor Program, was really an excellent compliance tool, and of course reminded all recipients and subrecipients, and many of these, as Mary Beth pointed out, these were new to managing federal funding. And whereas the idea of grants or free money is very attractive, the fact of the matter is great responsibility comes along with those grant funds.
And Liz, and New Jersey was pretty scandal-free, right? I mean, there were some issues that were found, but nothing that resulted in a major scandal. And the the program was set up to find those issues very early on.
That's correct.
Yep. So that's a
I think
lovely.
it was fairly, yes, a successful governmental effort.
Right. And again, this is a very, very extremely complicated issue. But if you're in the political leadership, make sure your agencies have the authority to make the rules and that they feel that they're supported. I can't emphasize enough how unsupported the Department of Education felt, according to what I've read, by everything from law enforcement, USDA, Inspector General, political leadership. And if I'm wrong, I'm hoping that I'll be corrected by people who have more knowledge of this. Supporting resources for program infrastructure. Right now, the administration is looking to limit the G&A or the administrative costs on grants. I don't know that that's necessarily a good idea. I think that some of the stuff, some of the things they're doing are wonderful. They're hitting a lot of the fraud, but that program infrastructure is so critical. Review the state audit findings and inquire about significant and repeated findings. And incorporate, as we said, the opportunity for subrecipient feedback into mandated monitoring programs. I mean, you could actually codify that. It sounds like a little bit of a little bit of overkill, but it's really interesting when you get their feedback. And then this waiving of oversight requirements, that has to be done so carefully. We've worked with folks who were under extreme pressure from the federal government, who wanted to get all this money out so quickly in order to get the economy moving, and they were willing to have some fraud occur in order to get this money out the door. But people at the state level were under pressure not to validate some of these applications they were receiving in at least one of the programs we're working with. So we actually saw that not only in the Minnesota case, but in a number of places. And again, this comes from the political leadership who has a different goal than the oversight folks. And so with that, I just wanted to let you know that we're a woman-owned business, that we oversee large-scale grant programs nationwide. We offer fiscal compliance reviews, programmatic monitoring, risk assessment, internal controls, data analytics, and basically everything that we talked about today. And we have a couple of three of our services are Guardrails 360 that talks about it's really getting an organization ready for these massive programs, or working alongside a program team and saying, okay, let's see your procedures. There's something from this requirement that needs to be put into that. And so we're just kind of the support. I look at it like a marathon runner is running, you're the marathon runner, and we'll bike alongside with you and give you support as you're undergoing this, you're in this massive race to get this money out the door. We also do technical assistance, and then something called meaningful monitoring, which we talked about a bit. Do we have any questions?
We do have one in the chat feature. I will remind everybody that if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the QA section located in the top of your Teams bar. So Mary Beth, we have one question so far. It says, how do you go about determining relevant source data for AI to analyze, i.e. what structured data and unstructured information, such as what you mentioned, videos, training, PDFs, etc., do you look for?
Well, and again, that's on a case-by-case basis, but it's based on decades of experience. I mean, we are really familiar with legal, programmatic, fiscal documents that government produces. And you could actually go to the website of Freedom of Information Act in some areas, and not everybody would have that, and just peruse some of the list of documents that are available at that point. But we're really, really, maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I was an investigative reporter in my young days, and really learned a lot about what documents are out there. And of course, you being on the inside will have access to a lot of documentation that people external to the agency won't. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
All right. Is there any more questions?
Well, I do have a request, and that is if you like this webinar, would you just let us know in the chat? And if there's something that you'd like us to talk about in the future, please let us know. And you know, we're willing to we'd be welcome the opportunity to sit down with any one of you and talk about any challenges you may be having. And Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and conclude this webinar. Once again, thank you so much, Mary Beth, for this informative presentation on fraud guardrails for your grants program. If you would like to watch this webinar again, you should have it in your email in a couple days' time. If you'd like to receive invitations to future webinars, you can sign up for our mailing list on our website. As Mary Beth said, if you have any questions or any suggestions that you would like discussed, please feel free to reach out using the contact information on your screen. Furthermore, we encourage you to visit our resource library to discover a wealth of grants and grant oversight resources to help you manage your grants program. This can be found at vanderwillgroup.com/resources. We will be having another webinar on December 3rd, so we hope that y'all will join us for that. On that one, we'll be taking a closer look to walk through any data analytics and AI and how that can benefit your grants program. Once again, thank you all for attending this webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for your attention. Have a great day.